And so now I'm going to turn to Harold so that we can introduce him. Harold is a fellow Canadian, although I'm living in the States, and he only lived here back and forth for 5 years in Bothell, working for Quinton Instruments, which was one of the early companies, I think in about year 2000. You'll have to tell us the whole history about that, but they were a very early medical device company here in the Seattle area. And so Harold can share some of the stories about that. But as often what happens in this space, people who become experts in the area sometimes start in electrical engineering, and that's where Harold at his beginning. He also has a PhD in biomedical engineering, and it's from the University of Toronto, which is not my alma mater, but still U of T is a great facility. Harold's been actually working as a consultant in the medical device industry, but this is not his only work as a consultant. He's had more than 30 years of experience in product development, operations, sales, management, all of the things that are necessary to make a company go forward: strategic planning, business development, and due diligence. And so he has an understanding from a helping the company perspective, but also on the due diligence, what does it take to help a company be successful? He's the chair of the board of Exact Imaging, which is a prostate cancer imaging company. He's had 5 previous board positions and successful exits, so he kind of knows what it's like to do the ropes. He serves as a chief technology officer at VTAA Medical, which is an aortic aneurysm diagnosis and therapy, and is a member of a strategic advisory board of IGAN Partners. He has actually spent the whole day doing pitch evaluation for a program that he's involved in, and maybe he can tell us what the hot technology therapy innovations are from that discussion, if it's not confidential. I think I'd like to just say he's brought more than a dozen medical devices to market, which have diagnosed and treated hundreds of thousands of patients. And so that, if we talk about what we want to do in Apus Health Angels, our interest is increasing the ecosystem of health startups, making sound founders, but we're all doing it for the purpose of actually doing well by doing good. And so I turn it to Harold for our presentation tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. We know it's 3 hours time difference, and we appreciate that you're here.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here, even though it's past my bedtime. Anyway, I will put my slides up, but while I'm speaking, this is a small crowd, so please don't hesitate to interrupt and ask questions or lead me down another path, whatever you like. So I'm going to share my screen now. And can you see it?
Yes, it is clear.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
It's in presentation mode for you. So if you could put it into just full screen, that would be helpful.
So I thought it was full screen. That's strange.
It was, but now we're seeing your presentation mode.
Okay, so is it now full screen?
That's okay.
Oh, good. Okay. So what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is business models. What business models are common in MedTech, and why does it matter to you, whether you're a CEO or whether you're an investor, and when you should consider changing business models. Sometimes that means partnering, sometimes that means going to a whole radically different model, and why this is important for success. This talk, some of this talk was originally given at Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto a couple of years ago. Sunnybrook has a development program which is modeled after the Stanford Bioscience program, and they invite speakers in all the time to train new entrepreneurs. It's kind of a different kind of incubator. Anyway, We all know the normal medical business model. An invention comes out of the university, company is formed, company gets some financing, hopefully from angels in the beginning or friends and family. They develop a product, they manufacture the product, they sell the product, they do it all themselves. And then in the end, the company gets acquired or go public and everybody gets rich and is very happy. It's a great business model, but it's not the only one and it doesn't apply to everybody. And you can't sometimes make a square peg fit in a round hole. So why doesn't it work sometimes? There's the usual things, lack of experience of founders in business and lack of market knowledge and stuff like that. But the main reason that it sometimes doesn't work has to do with the value proposition. Sometimes the value proposition is not right for that business model. Sometimes the value proposition, sometimes you're more valuable to other companies. Sometimes you're more valuable to consumers. Sometimes you're more valuable to hospitals. Sometimes it's your technology that's valuable, not necessarily an end product. And very often with many companies, the path forward is not straight. You can start with one business model and sometimes you have to pivot in order to make things successful. And I'll go over a few of these things. Why should you care? Because the honest answer is that you don't have to do it yourself. A lot of entrepreneurs start out thinking, I'm going to prove myself.
Harold?
I'm going to do it all myself. Yes.
I'm going to interrupt for just a second because I have the advantage. Your slides are still in the down the side form, but so I can see what your next slides are. And I'm wondering whether or not they're not advancing the way you'd like, because we're still on the agenda.
Oh, okay. I don't know why this is happening because on my computer, this is advancing. Can you see?
Now, that's the first time we've seen that one, the normal MedTech business model spinoff. So,
okay, I'm going to keep it in this mode if that's okay then, Elizabeth.
yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I don't normally have this problem on Zoom. Zoom is normally very good at screen sharing, but tonight it is screwing up. Okay, so I showed this one. This is the normal business model that everybody thinks they're going to do as they form a company out of a university. As I said, it's not always the case. So why is it not always the case? And the answer normally comes down to your value proposition. I'm going to say the words value proposition a lot tonight because value proposition determines strategy. And that's really what we're talking about here is business strategy. So why should you care? Most young entrepreneurs that I meet have the attitude that they want to do it themselves. They want to follow that business model no matter what. And the honest truth is nobody cares if you follow that business model. Nobody cares if you did it all yourself. The important thing is that you be successful. So you have to keep your mind open to other ways of operating. Okay, so for the entrepreneur, you want to choose the business model that will lead to success. And for the investor, you want the business model that leads to the best return and has the lowest risk. But also, if you end up on the board of the companies that you invest in, you want to encourage your companies to pivot when it's appropriate to do so. And of course, not to pivot when it's not. So let's start off talking about partnering. Partnering runs against the normal business model because in the normal business model, you do everything yourself. So sometimes you want to partner with established medical manufacturers and outsourced manufacturers, which I spelled wrong, sorry. And I'm going to illustrate this with 3 case studies. The first one is the company that I'm actually chair of called Exact Imaging. Exact Imaging has a new ultrasound system that they call micro ultrasound, and it is for prostate cancer. And as you can see in the picture, normal ultrasound gives you a rather fuzzy picture of the prostate. And exact view ultrasound gives you a very, very precise picture, 300% greater resolution. And they do that by going to much higher frequency, and there's a few tricks they use to get penetration depth. Why is this important? Because with a fuzzy picture, you can't see the cancer. So you stick in your biopsy needles at random. They normally do 12 to 15 needles. But with microultrasound, you can actually see the cancer, you can target it, you can stick your needles right into the cancer. And it turns out that with microultrasound, you find 30% more significant cancers than you do with conventional ultrasound. So this seems to be a great value proposition, but Exact Imaging did not have enough money to start a direct sales force, because when you're starting out, of course, adoption rates start out low. Direct sales costs a fortune, and it would be very inefficient because you have a salesperson who goes in and they only have one thing to sell. So, you know, you have to fly around the country because you don't have enough people to have small territories. You have to take this equipment with you. You have one thing to sell, and then you leave. So what were they going to do? The answer is, the answer is they partnered with a major industry player in prostate cancer called EDAP, a French company. And EDAP has a large sales force. And EDAP had a similar problem. They had only a couple of products, much larger, more established company, but they wanted more for their salespeople to sell. So the two companies, Exact Imaging gave EDAP distribution rights. So now there is one sales force that sells both products to the same customer. The products are very synergistic because Exact Imaging is targeted biopsy and EDAP is targeted treatment. So both companies saw a dramatic improvement in adoption and a dramatic reduction in the cost of customer acquisition. There are advantages and disadvantages of outsourcing your distribution. And there are risks and mitigation. So every time you want to think about your business model, you want to think in terms of risk and mitigations of those risks. And you can see here on the screen, advantages like name recognition and a much larger sales force that you're not paying for. Also, established players have an installed base. So they are not acquiring new customers one at a time. The first thing they're going to do is go back to their installed base and say, we have something else for you. And they have instant access to those customers. Now, distributors, big companies, they want big margins, typically 35 or 40%. And that sounds like a lot, but if you look at the cost of selling for a young startup company, it's often a great deal more than that. It's sometimes 100%. And finally, successful distribution partnerships often lead to acquisitions. But there are risks. And the biggest risk is that your revenue is in somebody else's hands. If they lose interest, then you're basically toast. Unless you have a way of terminating the agreement and going back to another distributor or a direct sales model, you could have no revenue if they lose interest. And you have to remember when dealing with any distributor or with a big company that your product is not their product. Their interest is making money off their product. You're number two. So you need to have a very good lawyer to draft a very good agreement that has things like early termination clauses, that has clauses that make your distributor promise that they're going to pay the same commission to their salespeople as they pay with their own products, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that you don't realize with distribution contracts is that if you don't structure them correctly, you lose contact with the end customer. And losing contact with the end customer can be the kiss of death for a company. You need to build into that distribution agreement that you still have access to those customers. Okay, case study number 2. This is a company that was in Minneapolis. I was also chairman of this company. And they have products in cardiology, disposable products. The problem with disposable products is that they're very expensive to manufacture from the perspective that the equipment that you need to manufacture these products is very expensive. So for Rhythm Science, they needed extrusion machines, they needed molding machines. There were like 8 or 9 different processes that had to be used, all of which had expensive machines, and they didn't have enough money to set up all their own manufacturing. So again, they had to deviate from the normal business model and partner with an outsourced manufacturer. So they actually contracted with a very well-known contract manufacturer in Minneapolis. They had all the equipment that was necessary. They had very deep expertise in manufacturing. And Rhythm Science paid $600,000 to this contract manufacturer for design transfer. So everything went pretty well for the first year, but then this contract manufacturer lost their major customer and they went bankrupt. That was a big shock. We had to go to another contract manufacturer, which meant another $600,000 for design transfer to the new manufacturer. And we had to do a down round in order to get that money. But it all worked out in the end, and Rhythm Science was acquired about 1.5 years ago by Acutus Medical. So when you do,
ask me a quick question there?
Please.
So why did you have to pay another $600K in NRE with the transfer?
So design transfer is part of design control under ISO 13485. And what you have to do is you have to qualify all of your equipment and all of your processes. So you have to do design transfer whenever you go to a different manufacturer, or even if you are manufacturing it yourself, but you move to a new facility. You have to do what's called installation qualification, operational qualification, and performance qualification of every process in your manufacturing chain in order to prove that your manufacturing gives you the same quality that your original engineering prototypes had.
Okay, so your CM was charging you for your IQOQPQs.
Exactly.
Okay. Not all manufacturers will charge for that if it's already been developed. So I was just trying to clarify where that was coming from. So thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
You're right that it is a matter of negotiation, but we at the time were quite low volume. And if you're quite low volume, you don't have much negotiating power.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. So the advantage of outsourced manufacturing is that manufacturing is hard. Those of us who came up through engineering school, we kind of had this idea that product development was the hardest thing in the world. And once the product was developed, manufacturing should be easy. And it turns out when you get out there that it's almost the other way around. Manufacturing is hard, and you need a lot of experience to do manufacturing properly. So going to an outsourced manufacturer is great because it reduces your risk dramatically. You're dealing with a company that has lots of experience with all the different processes. They have their own quality systems. They have everything, you know, they've been audited. You can hit the ground running. And they also have usually very, very expensive equipment. But you have risk. And the risk that Rhythm Science found was that, you know, the company went bankrupt. So you lose a certain amount of control. Your ability to deliver your product is in someone else's hands. And if your volumes are small, you know, put yourself in your outsourced partner's shoes. They're going to deal with their largest customers first. Their largest customers make them the most money. So there's risk there. And again, that risk can be mediated by having a very good lawyer draft up a very good agreement that makes sure that you have escape clauses for all the things that can go wrong. Okay, another thing that happens in outsourced manufacturing is that sometimes the person that is assigned to be your manager, managing your product, leaves. And the new person doesn't know anything. And things go wrong. So there's risks.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Mr. Howard, I have a question, please. You're talking about the development of the medical device. How about to comply the standard? For example, like 13485, 14971. How about
Right.
the possibility of the manufacturer about that? Thank
Okay,
you.
so if you are the official manufacturer of the product, which means if your company name is on the product, then you are required to have a quality system anywhere in the world, Canada, United States, Europe, China, Japan, and most people go for ISO 13485 as the quality system. Now, if you do not have 13485, if you haven't been certified to 13485, and most startups have not been, then you have a decision to make. You can either implement an entire quality system yourself, which takes 9 to 12 months to do and takes money, or you can go to people who are certified. So you can go to a company that does product development, for example, and if you go to a company that does product development and they are certified to 13485, then you don't have to be for product development. And the same thing for manufacturing. If you go to a manufacturer, then all of those chapters in 13485 that deal with manufacturing, you don't have to worry about because they're doing it. Now you still, as I said, if your name is on the product, you still have to get 13485, but you have fewer processes to worry about. Does that answer your question?
Okay, thank you. That's clear. Okay.
Yeah.
But another one, how about the risk management about that? This include of the 13485.
Okay, sorry, I didn't hear that question. Could you try again?
How about the comply to the risk management standard? For example, like 14971.
14971 is the risk management standard.
Yeah, how about that?
So when you are designing your product, you must comply with 14971. It is mandatory. And risk management applies to both product design and product manufacturing. So in product design, you have to do something called a hazard analysis. And then during the design phase, you have to do something called an FMEA, which is a failure mode effects analysis. And when you are manufacturing, you have to do a process failure mode analysis. So yes, you have to do 14971. As I said, you can do it yourself, or you can get other people to do it for you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank
Okay.
you very much.
Anyway, so we were
I'm going to
talking.
interject here. I'm
Yep.
just actually going to put a link for a session that we had previously. It's on our YouTube channel that was specific to our regulatory requirements, and it kind of outlines at the different class levels some of the things that you need to be. So it might be a reference for you for this discussion as well, for
Right.
our panel here. I mean, for our guests.
Yeah. But just to let you know, 14971 applies to all classes, class 1, 2, and 3. Anyway, we were talking about outsourced manufacturing. And as I said, there are many advantages, but there are disadvantages and there are risks. So keep those in mind. So that's all I have to say about partnering. I want to go on to talk about other business models. So common business models, and I'm going to talk about each of these individually. The license model, managing for an exit, which is, I think, probably what most of you are really interested in. And also the model of trying to become a large independent company that is not having an exit. And which one of these is best? The answer is there's no answer to that. Each of these can be best. It depends. What I've said here is it depends on your product and your market and your financing. What it really depends on is your value proposition. Where can you realize the most value? Okay, so let's start with the licensed business model. The licensed business model is pretty easy to understand. It's the one that Intel uses. So Intel does not make computers. Intel makes processors, and they license those processors to every computer manufacturer in the world. And the same thing goes on in MedTech all the time. The characteristics of a license model is that you're pretty much entirely R&D focused. You don't necessarily have to do any manufacturing, and you don't have to do any sales to retail. Your sales are all wholesale. And typically for licenses, you have a technology platform, referred to as a horizontal model, a family of components or processes. So if you look at Intel, they have dozens of different processors, for example, that they sell. And your customers, this is a business to business type of model. You're not paying end users. And here's a couple of examples. Surmodics, for example, supplies coatings, surface modification, coatings that make catheters more slippery, that make them resistant to bacteria, quite a few other things. Surmodics is being used by nearly every catheter manufacturer in the United States right now. Context Vision sells software. They're located, I think, in Sweden. They do image analysis, and they sell their products to all of the major imaging companies and a lot of small imaging companies. And as a matter of fact, at Exact Imaging, we use context vision image analysis software. IBI, Interface Biologics, is a company in Canada, of all places, and they have, it's similar to coatings, but it's a way of manufacturing products to make them resistant to infection and resistant to clotting. And they've been doing very well. So what are the strengths and the weaknesses of the license model? The good thing is you don't need a lot of capital. You're not doing, yep.
When you're talking about licensing, you're not talking about licensing IP. You're talking about producing components or processes that would be sold to the OEM. Is that correct?
Actually, both. So
okay, you're putting both in the same category. Okay,
I'm
thank
putting
you.
both in the same category, but it's a business model, so it's not a one-time license. It's a license that's going to yield royalties as products are sold. Whether you actually build those products or the people you've licensed to build the products, is kind of the same thing. So as I said, low capital requirements because you're not doing your own clinical trials. You're not doing your own regulatory submissions. The companies that you're licensing to are doing those, and you're not doing your own selling. The best thing about the license model is that you have the potential to sell to the entire market. So if you have a company and you're making an ECG machine, well, you're going to get a percentage of that market, assuming that your ECG machine has some value proposition. It's a big market, and maybe you'll get 5 or 10% of it if you've got something really good. But if you are licensing a product that goes into ECG machines and it's really good and everybody buys it, then you're selling to the entire market. So licensing can be very, very lucrative. As you can read the weaknesses for yourself, there's no contact with the end user. So understanding what the market wants and understanding how the market is changing can be very difficult. Margins are very low. So every company that you're selling to is looking upon you as a cost of sales. They want the margins for themselves when they sell the end user product. So negotiations for licenses are always very difficult. There is no security in the license model. I was consulting to a company in Israel that had a software product that they licensed, and they licensed it to Philips. And Philips started selling tons of them. And they were doing very well. And 3 years later, Philips kicked them out. They had developed their own version of the same product so that they could increase their margins. For investors, the exit potential of a license model is very challenging. Because if you're selling to everybody, who's going to buy you? Who's going to acquire you? If a company that you're selling to acquires you, you're going to stop selling to everybody else, which means that you're going to lose all your revenue. So exiting from the license model is difficult, but it can still be a good model for entrepreneurs. Because, as I said, there's a low capital requirement, so you don't need a lot of investment. When is the license model the best strategy? Is when you have proprietary technology or proprietary software that has significant barriers. Okay, a medical device company needs it, but they don't want to spend the time and money to develop it. Good example of this in the software area was a company called Sidara Software, which was also a Canadian company, and they developed all kinds of software components for DICOM access. So DICOM is the industry standard for image storage, and all kinds of companies had to access these images in order to do image analysis and all kinds of things with X-rays and CTs and MRIs. And nobody wanted to read the hundreds of pages of the DICOM standard and write their own software. So Sidara sold all these companies these software tools to allow them to access the PACS system and access the EMR. And everybody knew that that software was validated and it was quick and easy, and they didn't have to do it themselves. So they were quite successful at that, and they got acquired by, I forget who acquired them, but they got acquired a few years later. So the license model is best when you have a technology that applies across a broad range of application and is very timely. So something comes up, it's very hot, everybody wants it, nobody has time to develop it. Maybe there's a serious issue in safety, and all of a sudden everybody wants this. So if you have that type of value proposition, the license model is for you. And How do you do it? The key to making the license model work is to meet with your potential customers very early. Do not wait until you have fully developed your product, because your fully developed product is probably not going to be exactly what they're looking for. If you go to your potential customers early, you will match their needs. And everybody's worried that, you know, somebody's going to copy you, you're going to give away the farm by talking to a potential customer before you have the product finished. In my experience, that very rarely happens. File your IP before you approach these customers, but then make sure that what you're designing is what they want, or else you're going to wind up designing it again. Okay, do not sign exclusive deals. If you're going to follow the license model, follow it properly. The license model says you sell to everybody. This consulting customer that I had in Israel, they violated that model. Philips made them a sweet offer and said, we're only going to give you this offer if you're exclusive to us. And they went for it, and they shouldn't have. Okay, and finally, find a way to keep in touch with the end user market. You can do that through your license model. One of the good things is to say, we'll license this to you, but then we will support your end customers. So we're giving you something, but in return, we get access to the customers. Okay, let's move on to the independent business model. Believe it or not, there are a lot of people who want to start a business and build it up and pass it on to their children. There are a lot of people who reject the normal business model of getting venture capital and then exiting. They want to become Bill Gates. They want to become Elon Musk. They want to build up something that's going to be big and stay there and, as I said, pass on to their children. And there are some examples. Baylis Medical out of Montreal, one of Canada's oldest medical device companies, they were largely self-financed. So they were a distribution company and they made a lot of money distributing products in Canada. And then they started to develop their own products. And eventually they stopped being a distribution company and they grew and grew and grew. I know the owners of this company very well. They swore to me up and down that they were never, ever going to sell. And then last month, Boston Scientific came along and offered them $1.75 billion, and they couldn't turn it down. But the whole idea of this company was to keep it here forever. Same was true with Conavi Medical. Conavi Medical makes intracardiac echo ultrasound and dual mode IVUS, intravascular ultrasound, and optical coherence technology catheter. And the owner of this company decided this was going to become a big company. It was going to stay where it was founded. He was going to pass it on to his children. And in the early days, the company was approached by venture capitalists because they were doing very well, and they were turned away because venture capitalists do not invest generally in companies that are going to stay independent. Venture capitalists need to have an exit. Venture capitalists have people that they have to report to that expect them to make money. Recently, Conavi got into a bit of trouble, needed more money, and eventually went to venture capital. But the reason that I bring these two examples up is to illustrate that to be an independent model, you really need to have an unusual financing model. Because if you go with most MedTech financing companies, they want an exit in 5 years. Okay, so if you want to be independent, you need to look for other financing. Independent model characteristics is you generally, instead of having one product, you have a family of products. Okay, one product is too risky. You want to have a family of products, and in general, you want to have products that are class 1 or class 2, not class 3, because class 3 products need a lot of money to commercialize. Class 3 products usually require large clinical trials, which these days cost a lot of money, and you can't do it yourself. You want products that have a great value proposition to the end user, but they don't necessarily have to be disruptive products. You can basically look for markets that have been ignored for a long time, where the products haven't changed in 30 years. And you go after those markets. They may be too small for the big companies like Medtronic or GE to notice. And you could make a very large impact and then expand from there. And as I said here, non-traditional financing. There are a lot of angels and there are a lot of investors that are attracted to this kind of company. But the important thing is that you have to make it clear to them that you intend to remain independent. Okay, strengths and weaknesses. The biggest strength of the independent model is that you retain control. You retain control of your products and you retain control of your future. Independent model is very good for long-term wealth creation, but it does take a long time. You're not talking months or years, you're talking decades in general. Independent model is very good for non-dilutive financing. Governments are always interested in sponsoring companies that are going to stay put, that aren't going to get bought by some other jurisdiction and move away. Baylis Medical, the company I talked about before, for example, went to the Canadian and Ontario government and got a $15 million non-dilutive, non-repayable grant for setting up manufacturing in Toronto. And they used that money, they set up manufacturing, they expanded their company within a period of 5 years from 100 people to 600 people, and started generating a lot of money. Weaknesses, as I say, very long-term and very difficult to capitalize. So to manage for the independent model, as I said, identify markets that have been ignored by the big companies. Identify markets that have a lot of independent distributors so that your sales costs are low, at least in the beginning. Okay, and be upfront with potential investors. There is nothing worse than thinking you're only going to sell 20% of your company to a venture capitalist, and then they come at you with a shareholders agreement, and in the shareholders agreement it says that exit decisions are made by the venture capital company. And that happens all the time. Okay, so when is the independent model the best strategy? It's a personal thing. Your personal goal is to create lasting value, and you have access to non-traditional sources of financing, including government financing. Independent medical device companies are usually founded by people with very deep expertise in that medical specialty. They're not usually founded as startup companies. They're usually founded by people who have been CEOs of other companies, or who have 5 or 10 years of experience in the MedTech business, and they have a big network within the medical specialty that they're in. They know everybody, everybody knows them, and they have an idea for a whole line of products, not just one product. Okay, so finally, everybody wants to talk about the acquisition or IPO business model. Bring up 2 examples here. These are companies that I was both involved in. One is called Cryocath. They're out of Montreal, and they made a product for cardiac ablation of atrial fibrillation. And they got acquired 12 years or 13 years ago now for $380 million. plus an earnout. And they had $35 million of sales at the time of acquisition. And this product's actually been a huge winner for Medtronic. When CryoCath was sold, they were selling 100 of these catheters a week. They're now selling 3,500 of these catheters a week, and they sell them for about $5,000 a piece. So big money. Visual Sonics is a company in ultrasound, and this was a diagnostic company in preclinical research. They were acquired by Sonocyte, and they had 32 million in sales at the time of acquisition. Sonocyte wanted this technology to take it clinical, whereas Visual Sonics was only preclinical. But notice the huge difference in valuation. They both had almost the same level of sales. So why was CryoCath worth $380 million and Visual Sonics a quarter of that? Anybody have any guesses?
Margin?
Leanne?
Margin,
Sorry.
Brett.
Go ahead.
I said maybe margin.
It wasn't margin, actually. Actually, both of them had very good margins. The answer is that therapeutic companies are worth an awful lot more than diagnostic companies. Okay, and that's one of the things to keep in mind when you're deciding whether you're going for the acquisition model, is keep in mind what your valuation in the end is going to be. So let's look at characteristics. Acquisition model, you need a disruptive product. You need a product that is going to change the standard of care. Okay, it's disruptive means you are disrupting the way medicine works with your product. It has to be big. It has to have very strong IP. So the acquiring company is really acquiring your intellectual property. And this is a very strong point because, you know, you've had a seminar about intellectual property, and I hear all the time young entrepreneurs tell me that IP is not good for small companies, because if somebody infringes on your IP, you cannot call the police. You have to take them to court. And if the company that infringes on your IP is General Electric or Siemens or Philips, your chances of winning in court are remarkably low. And the cost of an infringement lawsuit is enormous. The average legal fees for an infringement lawsuit are north of $3 million. So if you're a young company, how does IP protect you? The answer is it really doesn't. But what it does is it protects big companies. And if a big company is going to buy you, they're going to buy you because of the IP that you have, because they can defend it. And if the IP has good claims and they can make a lot of money with that IP, that's what they're paying for. So if you're in the acquisition model, you have to devote huge resources to building up your IP, because that's what's being bought. Now, the next thing about the acquisition model is that you have to have a product that is synergistic to a large company. In other words, your product has to allow them to sell more of their product. Okay? Because they're not buying you as a financial investment. They're buying you because you're going to help them make more money with their product. So I'll give you an example. I'm dealing with a startup right now, and they have a product that makes cardiac ablation more efficacious, higher success rate. And they are talking with a company now that makes an ablation catheter. So, and they're two different products. The company that I'm dealing with, the startup company, they have a business plan that says that in 5 years' time, they're going to be selling $30 million worth of product, and they're going to make a very nice profit of $5 million on that $30 million company. And they're talking to Johnson & Johnson. $5 million profit to Johnson & Johnson is lunch money, right? Why is Johnson & Johnson interested? The reason is that the market for ablation catheters is a $4 billion market. And if they can get an extra 1% market share, they make a fortune. And this company will allow them to probably get an extra 10% market share. That's why they're interested. You have to have a product that is synergistic to a large company. Okay, you need a product that's in a hot market. You know, there are trends, there are fads in medical devices. You know, 10 years ago, implantable defibrillators became very hot. If you had a new one that was better, you were in a hot market, you were going to get acquired. When I had my company, I had a company in cardiology a while ago. It got acquired, and I had a competitor who came up to me a year later and said, Harold, thank God you got acquired, because that made this sector hot, and I got acquired a year later. Okay, it's trendy. As I said before, understand where your valuation is going to be. If you have a high value disposable, you're going to get a lot of money for your product. If you have a capital product in diagnostics, not so much. The company that I told you about, CryoCath, had a disposable that was selling for $5,000, single use, and people were buying it. That's what big companies want. Okay, acquisition or IPO model companies usually require a lot of capital. Very often their products are class 3. Very often they have large clinical trials, so they're usually venture capital backed. And when does a company get acquired? Sometimes pre-revenue, but not often. There was a very famous case, a company called Biosense came out of Israel, was acquired by Johnson & Johnson, and they were pre-revenue. But everybody was talking about them, and Johnson & Johnson paid $400 million, and that was about 30 years ago. But most of the time, acquirers, even a big acquirer, does not want to absorb your losses into their books, okay? Because if you're going to chew up $10 million next year and they buy you, that $10 million comes out of their profit. And their stock price is directly related to the profit that they produce. So they would much rather wait until you are break even or even profitable, so that you're going to add to their profit instead of take away from it. So be prepared to last long enough to get to break even though there are a number of stories out there of people getting acquired pre-revenue. Anyway, let's do strengths and weaknesses. So there is absolutely no question that being acquired is the fastest way to get rich. You know, we are, the great thing about the MedTech business is that I think everybody I've ever met in this business is out to do good. They want patients to benefit from the profit, from the products that they bring to market. But you also have to be money oriented in this business. If you are not money oriented, you'll fail. You can't just do good. You have to do well financially in order to do good. You have to have demonstrated that you can make money for investors. Okay, anyway, it's the fastest way to get rich. It's not quite as fast as it used to be. When my company was acquired, there was no earnout. We were just paid a bunch of money, and then we had to go work for the company. But these days, almost all of the deals that I have seen lately, have a strong earnout part of that deal. So 2 or 3 years of earnout so that you remain involved and that you remain committed to the success of the product. Okay, being acquired can also be the best way to do good, in addition to the best way to make money, because all of a sudden you have a huge company selling your product all over the world. You couldn't do that. You didn't have the resources to do that, but all of a sudden you've got this huge company selling your product. Okay, and the last strength of this is that it gives you a track record that nobody can ever take away. And if you want to start another company and you go up to a venture capitalist and you say, I started a company and I exited and I got a really good valuation, you're the kind of person that they want to invest in. Okay, weaknesses. There is so much competition out there for VC investment right now. All of the universities, all of the hospitals, everybody all of a sudden is spinning out hundreds and hundreds of startup companies in MedTech. And as a result, the venture capitalists are overloaded with pitches from people, and they can afford to be incredibly choosy. So that's a disadvantage. Another disadvantage is the loss of control. I have entrepreneurs say to me all the time, I'm not going to lose control because I'm only selling 30% of my company. I'm keeping the rest, so I'm the majority shareholder. Well, good for you that you're the majority shareholder, but you still lost control. You will have to sign a shareholders agreement that gives your minority shareholders all kinds of rights. And one of those rights is normally deciding on the exit. Another one of those rights is that you have to have a board of directors, and they get a couple of seats on that board of directors. Now, what's the big thing about a board of directors? You report to the board. That means that the board has the ability to fire you even though you founded the company. And they do it all the time. I was on the advisory board of a venture capital company called Vengrowth quite a few years ago. They made 17 investments in MedTech. And over the years, they fired 16 of the founders. Now that was a bit extreme, but it does happen. It happens all the time. The acquisition model is very high risk. Problem with this business is you make a mistake at the beginning, you don't know about it for a couple of years. You make a mistake at the beginning, you don't design your product following 13485, for example. You apply to FDA and FDA comes back and says your product is adulterated because you didn't follow the standard. Or you make a mistake and you don't file your IP, or you do a public disclosure before you file the IP and your IP becomes worthless. And you don't find out until 18 months later when you get an office action from the patent office. So setbacks are often fatal. It's a very high risk, very high reward business model. The other weakness that people don't tell you about is that normally when you get acquired, the acquiring company will require that you sign an employment contract. So you have to work with them for a while. And if you're used to small companies and you're not used to big companies, sometimes you watch the big company mismanage your product, and your product is your baby and it's hard to watch. Okay, when is this model the best strategy? The answer is proprietary disruptive technology in a very hot area with potential synergies for investors. Okay, big market, high growth potential. Now, managing for acquisition. If you talk to people, the common expression is that companies are bought, not sold. What does that mean? That means that you don't go out and sell a company, you wait for one of the big companies to come to you and to say, We've seen you around, you're grabbing some of our market share, we want to buy you. Companies are bought, not sold. This has not been my experience. My experience has been that companies are sold, that companies can be managed to be acquired. And this is important both if you're a CEO, but also if you're an investor. Okay, how do you manage a company to be bought? Okay, first of all, you drive the company towards the characteristics of the acquisition model. Hot market, synergy with products. You design your products to do this. You keep that in mind right from the front. You also have to focus. Okay, everybody talks about focus and everybody starts out focusing, but pretty soon they're not focused anymore. Why do people lose focus? Because they start selling their products and one of their customers says, oh, it would be great if you can also do this. And you get all kinds of input like that once people start to know you. And it's very easy to lose focus. But if you're going to get acquired, you have to keep that focus in mind. Okay? Acquiring companies really like to talk to key opinion leaders. So if you have something that's really good, you recruit the top key opinion leaders in your field and you make sure and keep them happy. And why is that important? Because when you go to Medtronic to sell your company, the first person that Medtronic is going to call is their own key opinion leaders. Well, if the Medtronic key opinion leader is also your key opinion leader, you got it made, right? And also the key opinion leaders will go to the companies that they advise and say, listen, I'm working with this hot new company. You should have a look at them. So get yourself key opinion leaders. It's not that difficult to do. Key opinion leaders, their motivation is they want to make a reputation or maintain their reputation as key opinion leaders. So they want to be involved with the hottest new technologies. Okay? And the same thing is true with board of directors. Get yourself a great board of directors, directors who know something, directors who have large networks of people in your area, directors who can help you. In other words, you want smart money, not just money. Okay? And then the most important thing is you approach these potential acquirers early. It's the same advice for the license model, and it's actually the same advice for all the models. Approach, in this case, your customer is the acquirer. So approach them early. Tell them, you know, I just want to inform you what we're doing. I'm going to keep you informed. Eventually, we're looking to be acquired, and you're on our list. They want to acquire startup companies. The big companies, Siemens and Philips and Medtronic and GE, they'd have no products if it weren't for the acquisitions that they've made. They're always looking. So help them. Let them help you. And they will do that. Approaching acquirers early, I think, is the most important thing you can do if you're managing for acquisition. Obviously, you're going to wait until your IP is filed. You're not going to go that early. But once you are approaching that you've demonstrated feasibility, both technical feasibility and market feasibility and clinical feasibility, that's the time to start approaching these people. Even if you don't know them, walk up to their booth, say, is somebody here from business development? Talk to them. This is what we're doing. I want you to be aware that we exist. I want you to follow us. Eventually, I want you to acquire us. And they will. Okay? And listen to their advice. And their advice is going to be that big companies do not like risk. The way to get acquired is to eliminate all the risks. I'm not talking about just product risks. I'm talking about business risks. So technology risk, clinical risk, regulatory risk, market adoption risk, all of those risks you have to go over and eliminate one by one. One of the first things I did in my business was I invented a new type of electronic stethoscope. This was way back then when electronic stethoscopes were brand new. And I had a friend at Hewlett Packard. Hewlett Packard at the time was in the med device business. And I approached this guy and I said, look, here's what I've invented, listen to it. And he did. And I said, I will sell this to you right now for $1 million. And he looked at me and he said, Harold, come back to me when you have FDA approval, when you have sold your first couple of $1 million, when you have a couple of publications, and then I'll buy it. And I said, if I do all that, it's going to cost you $100 million. You could buy it for $1 million today. And he said, I understand that. I would much rather buy it for $100 million. And I said, why on earth is that? And he said, Harold, first of all, you have to understand people who work for big companies. He said, we don't really care about the company. We care about our career. If I buy something for $1 million and it turns out to be a bust, not only do I lose my job, but nobody else will ever employ me ever again. If I buy something for $100 million and it's a great success, I'm a hero and I get promoted. So I never forgot that. Big companies don't like risks. Eliminate the risks. Show them that the technology works, that it's manufacturable, that it's reliable. Show them that clinically you achieve the efficacy that you claim. Show them that you can get regulatory clearance in multiple markets, and show them that you have an initial sales curve sufficient to get you to break even. At that point, you'll be acquired. Okay, and one last thing is when you are negotiating to be acquired, you must have a strong balance sheet, which means you must have money in the bank. So when you go after financing at the seed level or the Series A or the Series B level, put into your budget that you need to have enough money to negotiate from a position of strength, an acquisition, or even your next financing. Because if a big company sees that you're going to run out of money in 2 months, what are they going to do? They're going to come back and offer you top dollar? No, they're going to wait. They're going to wait until you run out of money and become desperate, and then they'll buy you for a song. Okay, you must have a strong balance sheet, which means that you need to get financed for more than you think you're going to spend, so that you have at least 6 months of financing left when you start negotiating either an acquisition or your next financing. Okay, so in summary, there's lots of different business models. Don't be addicted to the one that everybody thinks is normal. The business model you choose depends on your value proposition. Who are you valuable to? And you need to seek investment that is consistent with your business strategy. Okay? And if you take money from investors, you are losing control. No matter how little, you know, from your first dime, you're going to have a loss of control. So be prepared for it. And finally, it is possible to manage for early acquisition or for acquisition in general. So go do it. And that's all I have. So I'm open for questions.
One of
Harold.
the middle ground.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I'll let you take it on.
I was just going to mention that somewhere in the middle there is a model that Looney Libs has been doing, which is a revenue redemption model, which allows you to get the investors out of your company through a revenue buyout. And it's still an equity play, but the exit is through buyback rather than through merger or through IPO. And that opens up a much broader range of companies that are possible to invest in and still have the investment scenario work. Our problem is that the companies that come to us are selling us their product. They're not selling us their business. And so they struggle with presenting a cogent story about why we should be doing anything in the first place, right? And so loss of control is maybe not the biggest issue. Loss of risk or management of risk doesn't even seem to be on their minds at the beginning, but clarity on what is it that they're exchanging in the deal that they're doing. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that part of the question, about the difference between being an inventor and being a business person.
You know, in the end, John, it all comes down to being able to put yourself in the shoes of the person you're talking to. What is it that they want? And then structuring the deal to give them what they need from you. And, you know, as you say, people will talk about their product when they're talking to a potential acquirer, and they forget to talk about what the synergy is between their product and the acquirer's product, or they haven't done their research to do so. And, you know, this is true whether you're talking to an acquirer or an investor. If you're talking to an investor, does the investor really care about all the minutia of your product? The investor cares about whether they're going to make money. So you need to convince them that you're going to be adopted as opposed to everything the product does. You need to talk to your audience. And this is really the most important thing. I haven't seen very often the model where you get to buy out your investors. I haven't seen that very often because generally investors in MedTech don't like it. They want to participate in the upside, in all the upside. And so most of the investors are not going to say you can buy me out for a certain amount of money, because the only time they would be bought out is if the company is doing really well. And if the company is doing really well, there's a lot more value there than that they could have received. So, I mean, it does happen, but it is fairly rare, at least from my experience in this business.
Yeah, so the way that Looney approached that for exactly that reason is their model. Actually, they only buy back half the shares so that they get some sort of return on their original investment, but then they're still in if it goes big and it's a big win, then they still see some of that upside. I was working with him a little bit on how would we apply this to medical devices. And the challenge that we ran into is that most people who do revenue-based financing aren't doing it on pre-revenue companies. They want to be able to see some revenue in place. And the reality is for most medical device companies, the majority of the real, the type of capital you need where you're going to get creative is really in those pre-revenue days, right? Once you have consistent, predictable revenue, you have a lot of options for financing if that's what you need. So it was an interesting one. I actually put together a model where I think it's technically possible to still make those kind of returns, but the risk is just so unproven at this point that it's unlikely you'd get enough people going after.
Yes, I want to press back on that feeling that you have of unlikely shrug your shoulders that you just did, because 99% of the people that are able to angel invest don't. And most of the people that are writing big checks are actually philanthropists, not angel investors. And so there's a woman named Stephanie Gripney who's doing the Impact Finance Center, who's trying to convince philanthropists writing checks to write regenerative capital checks. And the revenue-based finance is sort of a middle ground place where you can step to from philanthropy and expand the range of people who could write a check. And if there's any industry that has a benefit of, we have a mission from God and you should help us do this, it's the health-oriented medical missions that are out there. And so it seems like there's a huge group of people who are untapped right now, precisely in the market that you are modeling. So I think that if you had chosen to make that your life's work, you could have actually opened up, a large number of people to do that.
I'm still going to, John. I'm going to use my exit to seed my fund, okay?
Yeah, yes, please do, but I think that you can start earlier if you want. I'll help. Anyway, thank you, Harold.
You're welcome. I mean, I think, you know, for philanthropy, you know, there's certainly a lot. I mean, I always advise companies in a, you know, in a space like cancer or whatever, to go after, you know, talk to the doctors about their rich patients. And, you know, there's a lot of people interested in philanthropy. Probably take somebody, you know, specializing in that to find those people. And as you say, there's a lot of them out there. But the usual case that I've been involved with, I mean, for a professional investor to invest that way, you would probably have to have the kind of business that could limit their downside. So if you're going to limit their upside, but you can promise to limit their downside, it might be something that would be of interest to investors.
And specifically, in the normal distribution or in the regular distribution that we see, it's a power distribution. So 60% of the companies fail outright with a return of 0, and 30% return something less than 5x, and 10% produce more than 5x. And
Yeah.
so if you take that bottom 60% and you get them to give you even $1, you've totally changed the distribution of your risk.
True.
And that's basically, you end up modeling the companies that would be in the zombie company category. If you can get a return on your original capital and you can recycle that capital over the course of the fund, you can actually end up changing your power law. And at that point, if you're not having to get 100x on your 10% of companies, then actually a 10 to 20x gets you a return. Then, so anyway, it gets interesting. You have to find enough companies that fit that plan, but it gets interesting.
Yeah, the problem that I run into is that when companies get into trouble and they need more money, it's really difficult to say no. And sometimes you're on a downward spiral and you're trying to desperately to stop it, and you know, you're catching the falling knife. Especially individual investors get emotional about it, and so it's hard to protect the downside.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Are there other questions from other folks? Oh, go ahead. Yes.
No, I'll let somebody else talk. I have a different question, but I'll let somebody else talk. Who else has a question?
Sudhakar, do you want to bring your point up?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, absolutely. So this is interesting, but I'm not in the MedTech space per se, in the sense that it's a heavy capital investment up front. So, you know, if you're software based, a lot of differentiation value proposition goes into how we are distinct. Yes, there's a lot of IP work that we do as well. But ultimately then, just listening to the conversations and Caitlin's responses as well to Harold's, I guess, inputs, I'm thinking here going, I'm sitting here going, aren't we all talking about how we actually present the probabilities of success, be it creating a good business, be it creating all this differentiation where ultimately the product fit translates into X number of revenue streams that's impressive and so on. So how do we really package that up, I guess, when you're pre-revenue, but you have some sense for what that's going to look, because we have done enough testing, let's assume that we have enough indications of success, but where do we draw the line? How do we draw the line? How do we package that up? What is the storytelling there?
It's a very good question, but you know, I think probably every case is somewhat unique. You have to convince an investor or an acquirer that you have eliminated risk. And if you think in terms of risk, then it's a really good way to guide you in terms of how do you know when you've done enough? How much risk remains? What could go wrong? So you basically think of all the things that could go wrong and what the ramifications of those things are. And you get to a point where the risk has fallen and maybe is leveling out, and that's the time. You know, there's always going to be some residual risk. You can't get rid of all risk, but if you can take your technology to an average engineer and the engineer says, yeah, this is going to work, then you have partly eliminated technology risk. If you have software and you do the same thing with software professionals, if you have gone to a dozen different customers, physicians perhaps, or consumers, and they say, you know, if you can make this work, I'll buy it. You know, basically work to eliminate risk. And when you get risk to the point where the curve is flattening out, you've done enough.
Can I add a little bit of a wrinkle to it?
No, before you do the wrinkle, I want to jump on my soapbox if you don't mind. When someone had too much of my soapbox, then raise your hand and I'll shut up. The problem with startups is that they have their hand on the hammer, which is their product, and they have a brilliant idea, and they don't do their customer development first, like the lean startup suggests that you do. And they don't start with 100 people that are early adopters that have the same problem. And so they never really actually talk to a customer. They talk to these SMEs, which are subject matter experts, which are pretending to be customers, or they're talking to random people in this category of abstracty things with rubbery edges that they have not actually qualified. And so it's like saying anything with a wheel will carry stuff from the garbage pit to the city, right? It's not true. People are not all customers because they have the problem. So if you've done your customer development work, and you've run your workshops, and you've done your Zoom calls, and you've done your consulting, and you've done NRE on your prototypes, you have revenue. So there's almost no company, especially a software company, that should be pre-revenue by the time they're asking for outside money, because the place to ask for outside money is when you have evidence of traction. And the evidence of traction comes from engagement with the people at the front end of this thing that have the bleeding problem, that want the blood to stop now. And so if you do that work, that particular set of risk reduction, then a whole bunch of the wrinkles that you think are big chicken and egg problems through your process actually go away.
So
sorry, rant.
I agree with you, John. 90% of startup companies have not properly validated their value proposition. Okay, they think they have, but they haven't. And for a software company, as John said, you should be able to get to market without much capital. For other companies, especially companies with class 3 devices, you can't get to market without capital. But you can't
still sell that product without capital. You can't sell that product that needs qualification. There's lots of other things you can sell. Caitlin can sell consulting. She's good at it. And she could have a nice line of people backed up in a row saying, when that product is ready, I want to be slot number 1. Here's my $10,000.
Well, maybe, but you know, for a class 3 product that's going to take $50 million to develop, you know, it can be difficult. But I think the point is that the biggest risk that any company has is their value proposition. And validating a value proposition is really, really, really hard. You have to, I mean, if you can get a product to market and get it, you know, get a sales ramp, that's really, really good validation of your value proposition. If you can't get that product to market, you have to work very hard to eliminate the risk of your value proposition, talking to hundreds of people, you know, doing test marketing, doing all kinds of things, talking to KOLs, talking to investors. You have to validate your value proposition. And most companies, 90% of companies, don't do it enough.
So while I completely agree with all of that, can I ask a little bit different direction on Sudhakar on your original question? Because you brought up SaaS and you were kind of comparing, you know, these different industries. And I think one of the things that's really important to think about when we look at APIS in particular, right? For those who are considering investing in life sciences, is where the fulcrum is for that risk, right? So for example, bringing a product to market, yes, there's pre-revenue risk. There's capital that needs to go in before you have a chance to validate that revenue. But when you come to market, you can't have a competitor in a weekend spin up a competitive product the way that you can in some software, right? So if you can build it with no code, your competitor can build it with no code. And so that means that essentially what you're looking at is distribution is your primary differentiator. You don't have a technical moat, you have a distribution moat, you have a brand, you have, Similarly, you're looking at your average consumer SaaS company has an 8-month customer lifetime value. So when you look at retention average, right? Medical, you're looking at 7 to 10 years average. So what you're really seeing is that the profile of where that risk sits relative to someone handing you, a customer handing you cash is different. And so you have to find different ways to be able to de-risk your proposition, because so much of the risk is before a transaction occurs, but actually over the lifetime of the company, you're going to see your CAC to LTV ratios are so much better on medical devices than they are on enterprise that it looks like you've done the calculation wrong. You literally look at the equation and you're like, this can't be right. We must be doing this wrong. It's just that there's so much of that upfront risk where you've put capital in and you don't have any way to validate whether or not you're there in a way that, especially if you've been investing for kind of 10 years or less, you don't have to think about it that same way for other software.
Wow, this is good, but I still want to hit my wrinkle for a slightly different twist to it, in the sense that software in general, from a consumer tech, yes, I think that is fair, right? The AI, especially if you have AI in a tech stack, I'm getting two kinds of pushbacks. One is, for us to be able to build the knowledge base, it requires an entirely different I guess set of doors to open for us, because we don't have the mental health discussions between a patient and the provider available. So we are building our knowledge base. That is our core, I guess, area of expertise, and that is where the time is being spent, and we are building up that sort of differentiation, right? But then the flip of that argument. So when I start talking about it, I'm talking about the vision for where we could actually take this going forward. But then it's going to take AI engineers, of course, right? And the investors push back immediately is, oh gosh, that is so expensive. How are we going to go pay for it? So on the one hand, I have proven that what we are doing by doing whatever we are doing to create our initial seeding of the knowledge base is workable. So for me, the next phase is to be able to make it more expansive, so we can actually make it extensible and applicable to different domains in practice, right? So we just got past that initial stage. And as a layer of the case for, investment is good because that'll give us the AI ability to build out AI, that's when I get the pushback. And I don't want to hold up the conversation, but that's kind of the nuance to, yes, software, but when you have a deeper tech software, and then you also have limitations in terms of knowledge base, then it's a slightly different proposition.
So the pushback that you're getting is a technical objection as opposed to a market objection. Is that what you're saying?
It's a bit of their pushback, and this is Launchpad here, and this is a very informal feedback that I got from Launchpad guys that I actually know from some other circle. So his point was, in order for you to keep building this AI driven differentiation, you will have to invest in more AI resources, which means it's a lot more risk for the investor. So how are you going to really prove that that is something that's palatable or could be palatable is the question, really.
This is an investor that doesn't invest in AI that's saying this, just to be clear.
I'm sorry.
The investor, you didn't qualify the investor. You don't know where he's coming from. The person giving you feedback, it's really important to understand the context that they're coming from.
Got it.
And so the problems that people who are big company employees like Microsoft and Amazon employees, the things they lift up as flags in the due diligence are fundamentally different than what founders raise, people who have succeeded and had an exit raise when they see the same company, right? So different people pick at different parts of this thing. if you have somebody who invests and has a stable of AI companies, they would not have asked this question of you. They would have asked a very different question. And so you have to understand that the context of the question. Let me press a little bit on your wrinkle. Do you have an SBIR STTR grant?
We have our pitch accepted, so I have written up my proposal. I'm trying to get some final.
So an STTR, that commercialization phase 2 of that can be directly driven at how you're going to manage your data management responsibilities that are going to be a pain in the ass that you need to do to get you from proof of concept to production. Do you have a company that's providing you with green data?
No, we are creating our own knowledge base because this is not.
You know that they exist.
Yes.
Okay. Why are you not using one?
Because nobody has the data that they can give. So the only companies that could provide. Go ahead.
No, I don't know that. I don't have faith in that. But that, you should at least explore the question of whether or not there's somebody already pulling on it.
Yeah, I'm calling around the text lines and trying to see if I can mine that data.
Do you know Jacob Coco at AI Allen Institute?
Oh, okay. I see that you dropped that note. I'll follow up. Appreciate that.
They have an AI accelerator that solves this problem. Sorry, diving too deep.
From my perspective, I have to say that I agree with John. We all have to qualify investors. When you're a startup CEO, you kind of look for money and you don't care where it comes from as long as it comes. And that's not the right attitude. You have to pick your investor carefully. The smarter money is what you're looking for. If you have an AI product, you want people who invest in AI. If you have a cardiology product, you want people to invest in cardiology because they're going to bring smarts to the table. They're going to understand your product a lot better. They're going to understand the risks a lot better. You're not having to train them from square one. So I think it doesn't just apply to you, but it applies to everybody.
No, that's a great thing. That's very important. That is a very insightful comment from John. And I'm just thinking back, he is not from the AI directly himself. As a portfolio, yes, they probably have invested, but he doesn't have direct experience in it. He doesn't understand that tech so much. So that's actually a very insightful comment. Brilliant. I love this. Thank you, guys.
And along those lines, that's where things like Crunchbase can be really helpful. So I don't know if you've already done that, but if you can pull, who's invested in these types of companies, and then you see who those investors are. Sometimes there's a reason why you're not a good fit, but sometimes that can be a place to kind of find similar.
Yeah, I have made a list of 100 top mental health investors.
That's the challenge, right? Is now you got to narrow it down to your stage, your target.
And each one of them has like 3 or 4 investments, and I worry about, okay, how do we fit in, and how are they going to look at us? And,
the list is too small. You need a bigger list. I understand that from an investor point of view, we're looking at 1,000 companies to find the 10 we pick. And so there's a reason why that's happening. So you have to build your list up bigger and stronger.
Even more. Okay.
I'm going to offer an opportunity for some other people. If you have some questions that you'd like, we're going to keep up that conversation. Come and join us for coffees on Tuesday mornings, which is informal to do that. Come back on next week where we're talking about how you put your value proposition into your guest profile. That'll be on the 18th. So we'll keep challenging you on those questions. That's what all these investors and company founders are here to do. So Anyone have any other questions that they would like to bring forward? Otherwise, I'm thinking that we're coming up against the top of the hour, and I want to make sure we give. Chris, do you have something you waved or?
Thank you very much. Dr. Wadlinger, thank you for your presentation. I had been thinking of two other business models that we've seen, locally here in the Seattle area. Perhaps they're edge cases, but I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on them. And one is really for the startup that can become an acqui-hire, where it's really very early and, they're really the team is acquired, perhaps with a little bit of outside investment. The other would be a kind of a structured development with terms for acquisition, where we've seen pharmaceutical companies very enthusiastic about a new technology coming out of the university, for instance, and being willing to finance the next development steps with the possibility, if things go well, to make the purchase on structured terms. And would you see those as, maybe that's really a subset of early partnering, but wondered if you had any comments on those models.
Sure. So one of the attractions for acquiring companies is your team, no question about it. And very often you'll hear acquiring companies say, we didn't care that much about the product, but we got a great team of people. So yes, build up a great team of people, and that does happen all the time. In terms of a structured acquisition, I was VP of product development at a company called Cardio Insight in Cleveland. And Cardio Insight had a dilemma. They needed to raise $30 million to do a clinical trials, class 3 product. And so the question was, do we finance it or not? And they went to Medtronic and they said, look, if this clinical trial is successful, you're really going to want this product. And if this clinical trial is successful, this company is going to be worth $200 million. Well, we will sign an agreement. We know you don't want to acquire us now because we're going to lose $30 million next year. But we'll do a deal with you that if you loan us the $30 million, then you will have the first right to acquire us, and you can acquire us for $120 million at the end of that clinical trial. And Medtronic said yes. For the company, it meant that they didn't have to finance. The company's valuation at the time was probably $30 million, so they would have had to sell half the company, right? Medtronic was going to buy a company that would be worth $200 million for $120 million. And they were risking $30 million, and that $30 million was a balance sheet item. It wasn't a P&L item, right? And everybody won. So the key to that was approaching Medtronic early. We had approached them a long time before this. We had shown them what we were working for, what we were working on. We had introduced them to our KOLs. They knew everything about us, and they were convinced this clinical trial was going to work because of the evidence that we had shown them. And the deal happened, and we got acquired. So yeah, it happens. It's one of the benefits of approaching a potential acquirer early. You can ask for that kind of a deal.
Thank you.
It's also one of the reasons why when you're doing your SBIR and STTR that you reach out to the potential acquirers and invite them to be participants in the SBIR process so that they get to see you in a close-up point of view. And then the phase 3, phase 4 parts of that process become natural conversations with them rather than trying to get through the front door.
And it also helps you to get your SBIR because they feel that that's a mark of validity that you have a company, a company or a thought leader that actually thinks so highly of what you're doing. And that reminds me that we did have our NIH panel where we had Chris Sasiela, who is the dynamic lead for the seed group at NIH, and Steve Flam, who's the entrepreneur in residence, talk about strategies for getting the support you need to get that SBIR grant. So I'm just here to help throw out some of the resources if it's helpful. Okay, so any other pressing questions for the good of the order that we want to talk about? Next week, it's going to be a little bit more company focused in that we're talking about your GUST profile. However, it's going to be essential for investors to know, if you haven't actually looked at GUST profiles, how to read them, what kind of information is actually going into them. John is leading this session next week, and Deborah Kessler from Body Guide, who is actually on our call today, is going to be the company sharing her GUST profile with Andrew Beavers, who's from Synthesis Marketing. And so, Deborah, thank you. Now we see you.
All right.
Delighted that you're going to be
Hey,
on next week. And I know you have some old friends in the audience here. So thanks very much for being our company. Why this is important is because you need a GUST profile if you wish to apply to APIS on December the 1st. And so we're set here to make you successful in all the steps that you need. And therefore, we're going to get some hands-on help on that. I'll be teaching at the university and in Will Canastaro's entrepreneurship program on that night. So I'll be glad to share any tips the next week. The next week is going to be Thanksgiving. So I'll see you again on December the 2nd. Thanks very much, everyone. I'll just draw us to a close.
Bye, everyone.
Hey, thank you.
Harold, it was really great.
Well done.
Yeah,
Harold.
great session, Harold. Thank you.
Harold,
Bye.
yes, you were absolutely excellent. I heard your, we talked through this a little bit beforehand. You gave great examples. It was so helpful. Thank you very much. And I am remiss totally for not once again saying thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Again.
Thank you very much.
See you later.
Bye-bye.